So there was a reclusive hermit family that disappeared in West Virginia, and nobody has found trace of them ever again. So this story comes from Seth, and while he didn't experience this, his grandfather experienced this. And this happened in the early 70s. And his grandfather at the time was like 17, 18. But there was this family that they called the Heskels. And they were pretty reclusive. They're hermits, basically. And they all lived in this shack or cabin. It was basically like a huge one-room cabin that was very roughly built. And they lived way out in the mountains. And they would spend weeks, even months, up in their cabin, just surviving off whatever supplies they had or whatever the husband could hunt. The husband was a fur trapper, and that was his sole source of income. And the wife didn't work. And she was described as very, unkempt looking. And in fact, the whole family was kind of unkempt looking, but she especially was unkempt. Her hair was matted. Her clothes weren't washed. And their adult kids lived with them, or their grown adult kids. And none of them were very talkative. The whole family was not very verbal. The husband, he'd only really speak in grunts. So whenever he would talk, he could talk, but his mannerisms were more like, leave me alone, we're just here to get supplies. So, anyways, Seth's grandfather was pretty curious about the area in which the Heskels resided. And the Heskels lived in like a dirt road, basically. It wasn't paved. And he described it as they used it so rarely. They rarely came into town, so that the trail that led to their cabin had grass growing out in the middle of it. If you've ever been on an abandoned trail, it looked like that. So Seth's grandfather decides that he wants to explore the area, and he rides his bike up there. And so he goes up this trail, and he finds that it's really thick forest. But eventually he gets to where it's kind of like a nice little, a meadow or a clearing. And that's where their shack is, or their cabin. And so when he gets up there, he sees the wife just sitting out on her porch. And he's watching her. She eventually sees him, and she just points. And it creeps him out, because she's not saying anything, she's just pointing at him. And then she stands up, and she's still pointing, but her arm is more out, and not saying nothing. At this point, his blood is already running pretty cold. And then out from the tree line behind their cabin comes the husband. And he said that he was carrying, he was carrying something, he described it as possibly a burlap sack or even a dead animal. He didn't know, he couldn't see that far. But the husband comes out of the tree line and stands right where the cabin is, and he too is just pointing. They're pointing, and they're not saying nothing to Seth's grandfather. It just really freaks him out. So he turns his bike around and just goes. And he goes back to town and then back to his house. And he just chooses to be like, hey, I did this, so I'll never do it again. It was fun while it lasted. It was really creepy. I'm done. Anyways, weeks go by. Nobody sees the family. Nobody thinks anything of that, though. Months go by again. Nobody sees the family, but some people are starting to talk, saying, "Hey, we haven't seen them in a while." Winter comes and goes, and so does spring, and that's when people start to realize, hey, we haven't seen him bring his pelts into town so that he could sell them, or take them to the fur auctions. And by that point, people were kind of like, okay, we should send somebody out to check on this family. So they send the police out there and some, men who know the area pretty well. They send them out there, and they get there, and their cabin is burnt to the ground, and it's been burnt for months. And so when they look for evidence, there's no evidence of bodies in there. There's no bones, no nothing, no teeth, whatever. A lot of their belongings are charred. But the weird thing is their vehicle was outside. Their vehicle was there. So they never physically moved out. And the husband's traps were all out there too. And he had a lot of traps, and they were just still there. It was as if they disappeared and their cabin caught fire and burnt to the ground. But to this day, nobody knows what happened to the high schools. Nobody found them again. A whole family just completely vanished without a trace. And their cabin is burnt to the ground. And nobody will ever know, I assume. And anyways, that's Seth's story. And if you want me to read out any of your paranormal stories or anything scary that's happened to you, you can go ahead and email me or DM me, and I can read it out for you. And I will drop my email in the description. But I thank you all for the follows and the likes, and I hope to continue making more of these videos.